Hello. So in this lecture, I will be discussing the essay from the syllabus, We Refugees, and it is an article written by Giorgio Agamben, and it is from a symposium about Hannah Arendt's essay, We Refugees, which is a very well-cited piece of scholarship and a really important essay about moral philosophy and citizenship and human rights. Also, I hope you're all doing well, and I hope that you are enjoying the course thus far. Thank you. Giorgio Agamben's essay asks us to consider fundamental moral questions and ethical questions regarding legal rights as opposed to inalienable human rights. The essay asks us to consider the relationship or perhaps the difference between language, law, and the materiality of humanity. Hannah Arendt published the essay We Refugees in 1943, shortly after arriving in New York. Arendt is arguably one of the most impressive European philosophers in the world. Her concept, the banality of evil, has been cited everywhere. And Arendt used this idea of the banality of evil to discuss the trial of Eichmann, a Nazi, whom Arendt argued was a terrifying figure, and presents us with a set of terrifying ideas that Eichmann could be a Nazi, not because of evil or not even because of belief, but because he was just doing his job. And hence, evil can be quite banal. We can engage in repetitive tasks of labor. We can follow authority. We can just do our jobs without considering the greater implications and our role in fascism. Hannah Arendt was a German-American historian and philosopher. She was one of the most influential political theorists of the 20th century. Her works covered many topics, and she's best known perhaps for dealing with power and evil, as well as politics, direct democracy, authority, and totalitarianism. Arendt was born to a Jewish family in Linden, which is now a district in Hanover in Germany, in 1906. When she was 3 years old, her family moved to the East Prussian capital of Königsberg for her father's health care. After completing secondary education in Berlin, Arendt studied at the University of Marburg under Martin Heidegger, with whom she engaged in a romantic affair that began while she was a student. She obtained her doctorate of philosophy at the University of Heidelberg in 1929. Her PhD dissertation was titled Love and St. Augustine. Arendt married Gunther Stern in 1929, but soon began to encounter increasing anti-Semitism in the 1930s in Nazi Germany. In 1933, the year Adolf Hitler came to power, Arendt was arrested and briefly imprisoned by the Gestapo for performing research into anti-Semitism, which was declared to be against the law by the Nazis. On release, she fled Germany, living in Czechoslovakia and Switzerland before settling in Paris. There, in Paris, she worked for Youth Aliyah, assisting young Jews to emigrate to the British Mandate of Palestine. She was stripped of her German citizenship in 1937. She divorced Stern that year. She then married Heinrich Blücher in 1940. When Germany invaded France that year, she was detained by the French as an alien. She escaped and made her way to the United States in 1941 via Portugal. She settled in New York, which remained her principal residence for the remainder of her life. She became a writer and editor and worked for the Jewish Cultural Reconstruction and became an American citizen in 1950. With the publication of The Origins of Totalitarianism in 1951, she established her reputation as a great thinker and author. She wrote many books, including The Human Condition, Eichmann in Jerusalem, and On Revolution. She taught at many American universities while declining tenure-track appointments. She died suddenly of a heart attack in 1975 at the age of 69, leaving her last work called The Life of the Mind unfinished. Arendt has left a great legacy in the liberal arts, humanities, and social sciences, and also in law and legal theory. In 1998, Walter Laqueur stated, "No 20th century philosopher and political thinker has at the present time as wide an echo as philosopher, historian, sociologist, and also journalist. Hannah Arendt's legacy has been described as a cult. She has been described as an intellectual of unmatched range and rigor. As a thinker, although she is primarily known for a series of articles known as Eichmann in Jerusalem that she wrote for The New Yorker, and in particular for the phrase, the banality of evil." The essay, We Refugees, was then written after Hannah Arendt arrived in New York and before she became a citizen of the United States of America, the country in which she would live the remainder of her life after being exiled from Europe due to Nazi persecution. In We Refugees, Hannah Arendt writes, quote, "We lost our home, which means the familiarity of the daily life. We lost our occupation, which means the confidence that we are of some use in this world. We lost our language, which means the naturalness of reactions, the simplicity of gestures, the unaffected expression of feeling. We left our relatives in the Polish ghettos, and our best friends have been killed in concentration camps. And that means the rupture of our private lives. We lost our home, which means the familiarity of daily life. We lost our occupation, which means the confidence that we are of some use in this world. We lost our language, which means the naturalness of reactions, the simplicity of gestures, the unaffected expression of feeling. We left our relatives in the Polish ghettos, and our best friends have been killed in concentration camps. And that means the rupture of our private lives. Giorgio Agamben situates Hannah Arendt's essay in our contemporary political moments in which there are many ongoing crises of refugees trying to flee various forms of persecution and trying to resettle their lives somewhere. This is a clip about Hannah Arendt.
Visez plus haut pour votre business avec la suite monday.com. Avec Monday,
The Hannah Arendt Center. Welcome to the virtual reading group. I'm going to be leading us through our next 3 sessions, and we're going to be starting off with Hannah Arendt's essay, We Refugees. So I'm just going to start by saying a couple of words about the context of the essay. This is actually one of my favorite essays of Hannah Arendt's. It's published in the beautifully edited volume by Jerome Cohn, The Jewish Writings, which is the copy that you have as a PDF. That essay is very uncharacteristic for Hannah Arendt. It's one of the rare examples we have of her speaking from a personal perspective, reflecting on what it means to be a Jewish person during the Holocaust, an immigrant and a refugee. It's also just one of the rare instances in which she reflects upon her Jewish identity. So the essay was originally written in 1943, 2 years after she emigrated to the United States, for a small Jewish journal, Menorah. The essay has largely been ignored by Arendtian scholarship until recent years. A couple of mentions here and there. Giorgio Agamben, if you're interested, has a well-known essay with the same title that he wrote in response to Arendt's. But the essay touches upon several themes that recur throughout Arendt's writing. It was written before Origins of Totalitarianism and the Human Condition, but as we'll see in this essay, she touches upon a lot of the major themes that are going to emerge in her later writings, where she tries to offer an understanding of the phenomenal appearance of totalitarianism in the 20th century. So this essay is going to dig into the relationship between loss and politics, thinking about hope and despair, optimism, what it means to be a person and appear in the world and have meaning, and what happens when the distinction between public, social, and private collapses, forcing us to turn back upon ourselves. And she's going to draw out a distinction that's really important between parvenus and pariahs, thinking about how it is individuals can find meaning in the world when the world turns them away. So let's start at the beginning of the essay. So Arendt starts by saying, in the first place, we don't like to be called refugees. I just want to pause there for a second. So one of the things that gets Arendt in trouble is her use of irony in her use of sarcasm. One thing to keep in mind as you're reading this essay, and I suggest everyone read it more than once, it's not that long, and there's a lot of different elements at play, is that this essay is deeply ironic, right? She is going to be using irony as a rhetorical device in order to illustrate how absurd the idea that we should just forget about it and be optimistic and move on is when one is facing something as horrific and unthinkable as the Holocaust, under the conditions of loss that were caused by authoritarianism and totalitarianism in the 20th century. So in the first place, we don't like to be called refugees. And she goes on to explain that historically, the term refugee has been applied to people who were forced to flee due to political persecution or because of some crime they had committed. And so those who were driven from Hitler's Reich merely because of their Jewish identity preferred to be called newcomers or immigrants because they had not committed any crimes. Right? And she notes that Jewish people were even more sensitive to being called refugees before the war because they wanted to be perceived as having left on their own accord to start over or rebuild their lives. She says, in order to rebuild one's life, one has to be strong and an optimist. Right. So Arendt's essay unfolds as she reflects upon the condition of Jewish refugees and the number of suicides that occurred during and after the war. And Arendt quickly reveals how the optimism that was necessary to rebuild one's life was created in the face of loss. And her disdain for this kind of vain optimism reminds us as readers that it's really an expression of despair, which is wrought from the many material and worldly losses that people suffered. So she goes on to say, our optimism is indeed admirable, even if we say so ourselves. The story of our struggle has finally become known. We lost our home, which means the familiarity of daily life. We lost our occupation, which means the confidence that we are of some use in this world. We lost our language, which means the naturalness of reactions, the simplicity of gestures, the unaffected expression of feelings. We left our relatives in the Polish ghettos, and our best friends have been killed in concentration camps. And that means the rupture of our private lives. Arendt's list of losses reaches past the components of daily life and into the core of human identity, what makes life livable in this world. Yeah. A sense of familiarity that allows us to move freely, an occupation that gives day-to-day life meaning, language that threads tradition and heritage together, human lives, loss, friends, family. The things that we acquire, all of these crucial elements of identity were completely stripped away. And with the physical disappearance of so much came the loss of meaning, right? Which for Arendt, as we know, is going to equate to the loss of the world. Throughout the essay, Arendt expresses frustration with the idea that Jewish people were somehow, in the face of this catastrophe, supposed to be optimistic, supposed to be able to move on and turn away from what was happening. And the ironic use of optimistic language that she begins with quickly becomes a reflection of the despair of the Jewish people and a recognition that the optimism was a kind of superficial attempt to overcome the losses. The need to forget and become optimistic becomes one and the same for the Jewish people who were forced to immigrate. And so reflecting on this desperate optimism, Arendt emphasizes that such forgetting is not possible. She says, no, there's something wrong with our optimism. There are those odd optimists among us who, having made a lot of optimistic speeches, go home and turn on the gas or make use of a skyscraper in a quite unexpected way. So from this passage, which is rather stark, we can see how Arendt drew a line between the public need to appear optimistic and the inability to be so in private. The private quality of such losses cannot be forced to appear differently in public. giving speeches, talking with others. And even though they were told not to talk about what was happening, they knew the truth. And when they couldn't bear it any longer, the optimism gave way to a kind of hopelessness. And she writes, quote, "Their optimism is the vain attempt to keep head above water. Behind this kind of cheerfulness, they constantly struggle with despair themselves. Finally, they die of a kind of selfishness." The attempt to forget, to not mention such events, to adopt a new home, to not be Jews, was in vain. Right? It was the denial of their lives and their selves, of what was left after all had been taken, that led them to reject the world by taking their own lives. And in this sense, it's easy to see why Arendt takes such a hardline view of optimism, but also how the losses that occurred shaped her understanding of what it meant to live in a world where all boundaries between public and private life had been destroyed. With the collapse of the social realm, individuals could no longer appear in public as they once had. The simplest act of buying bread became a reflection of their rejection from the world. Arendt writes, "We tried the best we can to fit into a world where you have to be sort of politically minded when you buy your food." They were no longer welcome where they had once been at home. Beginning from this place of loss, Arendt then moves into thinking about the different ways in which individuals dealt with what was happening. So she's going to turn away from suicide, although acknowledging it, as a response to the Holocaust, and offer us a juxtaposition between pariahs and parvenus, right? So the collapse of the social sphere pushed individuals into extreme states of hope and despair. And she's going to, if you're curious and you want to go back to the preface of Origin, she's going to echo this language there. For Arendt, hope and despair are intimately bound to the loss of oneself and the conditions that make life livable in this world, that make us feel at home. For Arendt, the turn to what she calls blind optimism constitutes the same dangerous turn away from the present moment. The denial of loss of the experiences of our existence affect the way that we interact with the world and one another. She says, the less we are free to decide who we are or to live as we like, the more we try to put up a front, to hide the facts, to play roles. Right? If we are told to forget, then we are in essence denying a part of ourselves and forced to live a factitious existence. Right? So for Arendt, to deny one's past and not come to a critical understanding of the world is tantamount to denying the human condition and turning away from humanity. When she's talking about putting on a front, she offers us the example of parvenus, and to illustrate the severity of this personality type and the mentality that the Jewish people were encouraged to accept, Arendt offers us the story of Mr. Cohn. So Mr. Cohn was from Berlin, where he claimed to have, quote, always been 150% German. In 1933, that Mr. Cohn found refuge in Prague and very quickly became a convinced Czech patriot, as true and as loyal as Czech patriot as he had been a German one. So when Mr. Cohn was forced to leave Prague under Nazi pressure in 1933, he found a new home in Vienna, where he became an Austrian super patriot. And on, Mr. Cohn became the best citizen wherever he was forced to emigrate to. And Arendt ends her anecdote with the addendum that, quote, as long as Mr. Cohn can't make up his mind to be what he actually is, a Jew, nobody can foretell all the mad changes he will still have to go through. Mr. Cohn suffers from what Arendt calls, this is a beautiful quote, the desperate confusion of these Ulysses wanderers, who are unable to admit to themselves their true identities. So in Arendt's rejection of the parvenu's optimism to start over, right, of the Mr. Cohn personality, who tries to forget who he was in order to make it in the world. She praises the pariah who chooses to take his or her identity and carry it through the world. Right? The pariah's refusal to forget is a way of acknowledging the losses that have shaped their identity as Jewish people. Arendt writes, quote, "A man who wants to lose his self discovers indeed the possibilities of human existence, which are infinite as creation. But the recovering of a new personality is as difficult and as hopeless as a new creation of the world. Our only option is to be who we are. And if we try to reject that essential fact of our existence, which is what cannot be taken away from us, then in a way we're rejecting the world that we've been born into, right? And so Arendt recognizes the limitless possibilities of human existence as the constant and ever renewing potential to begin again. And when a person tries to willfully lose himself, though, and become someone else, it's completely hopeless. In an attempt to cast off their past, to forget the experiences that they want to leave behind, but such forgetting is not possible. Right? And so Arendt's reflection on the desire to start over also reveals the desperate relationship between hope and despair. Right? And it illustrates how hope becomes this kind of superficial attempt at becoming and appearing someone else in the world instead of reckoning and coming face to face with who we are. And loss might create the possibility to begin anew, but contained within this possibility is the knowledge that we'll never be able to assimilate or regain our former self. The opportunity to start over, in another sense, is forced. Right? And this experience of loss is constituted by an extreme deprivation of familiar life. Right? For Arendt, the condition of the Jewish people has always been one of constant homelessness. When she begins "We refugees," she reiterates the stateless as she begins "We refugees," she reiterates the statelessness or loss of one's homeland. And this loss of one's home is not only central to her understanding of the Jewish question, but it reveals how fundamental a home for people, not necessarily a people, is to the human condition. The experience of this new kind of home, right, a loss that comes about through the denial of one's very self, permeates her writing. This lesson extends beyond the displacement of European Jewish peoples. Under the right conditions, any or all of us may be subjected to a similar experience of loss. And so when she begins the essay with "We lost our home" and moves to the broader losses of language, community, and country of origin, not having a proper place somewhere to call home, the Jewish people were doubly cast out from both their private lives and their homelands. And Arendt writes, quote, "The Jews have been wandering around the world for 2,000 years, taking in tow their belongings, their children, their nostalgia for a homeland. Without any specific place to call home, the entire world becomes a shelter. And life is not defined in terms of allegiance to some place, but rather becomes life in and of itself." So moving toward the end of the essay, Arendt says on page 273,
"I'm a therapist who goes to therapy, and some people think that's strange. The thing is, though, therapists are human beings just like..."
"If we should start telling the truth that we are nothing but Jews, it would mean that we expose ourselves to the fate of human beings who, unprotected by any specific law or political convention, are nothing but human beings. I can hardly imagine an attitude more dangerous, since we actually live in a world in which human beings as such have ceased to exist for quite a while. Since society has discovered discrimination as the great social weapon by which one may kill men without any bloodshed, since passports or birth certificates and sometimes even income tax receipts are no longer formal papers but matters of social distinction." And so here in these lines, she's reflecting upon the pervasive meaninglessness that has affected the social and political structures of the modern world, and how society, right, the social, comes to dominate and eradicate any meaningful difference that might exist for individuals as human beings. So in the final paragraph, Arendt is returning to the distinction between pariahs and parvenus. And she says, history has forced the status of outlaws upon both, upon pariahs and parvenus alike. The latter have not yet accepted the great wisdom of Balzac's "we did not come at all." Thus, they don't understand the wild dreams of the former and feel humiliated in sharing their fate. Those few refugees who insist upon telling the truth, even to the point of indecency, get in exchange for their unpopularity one priceless advantage. History is no longer a closed book to them, and politics is no longer the privilege of Gentiles. Refugees driven from country to country represent the vanguard of their peoples, if they keep their identity. Right? And this is a very powerful political argument that Arendt is making under the most extreme conditions of loss. That even if a people doesn't have a home, if the elements of everyday life, which give meaning, are stripped away, those elements that she listed out at the beginning of the essay, they still have their identity as a people that they can hold on to and can refuse to assimilate, to become something that they are not. And as long as they hold on to that as a form of truth, I think, then one does not need the rhetoric of optimism or despair. And so you can see how in recent years this essay has been picked up by a number of scholars who are writing on the current refugee crisis that we're facing today in our contemporary world, and which I hope we can talk more about on Friday. I'm going to stop there. I hope that's giving you a couple of touchstones to look for as you make your way through the essay. I'm looking forward to our discussion. Have a good week. Bye.
So Giorgio Agamben discusses Hannah Arendt's essay as well in the reading for this week. And Agamben states, he discusses the introduction where Arendt writes, in the first place, we don't like to be called refugees. Thus, Arendt begins her 1943 essay, We, Refugees, when she describes the psychic anxiety that weighed upon the Jews of Europe as they fled their homes and performed the labor of assimilation. In this essay, deeply felt and ironic from the start, Arendt depicts the social conditions that make one on the edge of political non-existence consider suicide. In her irony, Arendt deconstructs the doomed optimism of the parvenu, those trying to assimilate, and makes her case for the pariah, the outsider. And Giorgio Agamben discusses the figure of the pariah or the outsider as being, on the one hand, someone who suffers the most humiliating forms of indignation and persecution, but also someone who can emerge as the avant-garde of our time. Ultimately, I believe, writes Agamben, she seeks to call forward the need for a universal moral law that validates, through an active acknowledgement of rights, the existence of human beings beyond nation states. It is difficult to relate to the psychic effects of political non-existence unless one has traveled the liminal space of a refugee. So, as the academic in the clip discussed as well, Agamben also discusses Mr. Cohen, the example given by Arendt. In this brief but important essay, after sketching a polemical portrait of Mr. Cohen, the assimilated Jew had been 100% German, 100% Viennese, and 100% French, but finally realizes bitterly that on ne parvient pas deux fois, you cannot succeed or live twice. On ne parvient pas deux fois. And the relationship between succeed and live when translated is interesting. And this kind of relationship between double meanings in translation is something that Agamben also discusses throughout this essay. Arendt overturns the condition of a refugee and person without a country in which she herself was living in order to propose this condition as the paradigm of a new historical consciousness. The refugee who has lost all rights yet stops wanting to be assimilated at any cost to a new national identity so as to contemplate his condition lucidly receives in exchange for certain unpopularity and inestimable advantage. For him, history is no longer a closed book, and politics ceases to be the privilege of the Gentiles. He knows that the banishment of the Jewish people in Europe was followed immediately by that of the majority of the European peoples. Refugees expelled from one country to the next represent the avant-garde of their people. All right, I've used this quote multiple times. I think back again. The interesting point that the essay makes, and I think it's one to consider in the context of our course about race and racism, is this relationship, I guess, between persecution and creative production or political activism that Arendt really explains, but also perhaps enacts a set of performatives in this term, refugee, where the author interpolates this figure of the refugee as on the one hand being persecuted and on the other hand being political. And I think that this tension is interesting when we consider social movements and in relation also to the previous lecture I gave about Black Lives Matter in the United States of America and throughout the global North, that one can understand the most persecuted to also be the avant-garde, the leader in political struggle, and also the person who produces the most cutting edge writing or art or music of our time. And this is something I think that is reflected in a lot of liberal arts and humanities scholarship, beginning from Marx, that the revolutionary class is the one that perhaps is the most likely to exist as pariahs. And yet this kind of pariah status causes the necessity for a new language of politics and creative production. And I think that this is something that one can think of in relation to the lecture before this about the production or artistic production and new political language created by transgender and queer people of color. So again, we come back to this kind of tension in the course from a philosophical perspective between race as a construct and racism as a reality. And it is in this tension that I think political activism and creative production emerges. And it often does not emerge with a great sense of comfort or with a great deal of financial support or state recognition. It is only when these kind of ideas become gentrified and sold en masse to consumers that one really can grasp at the kind of immediacy of this position of somebody who is a pariah and must become the avant-garde in order to have a political position, in order to have a language in which to express trauma, and also sometimes in order to have something to do. That if one considers the relationship between writing and art and music and politics and a lack of state recognition, we can return to the previous lectures about the history of Black feminist music and Black activism. But creating a vocation or creating a language or creating a community is often done out of necessity because one exists on the margins of any official state recognition that one would want to receive. So Agamben makes reference to Nuremberg. Agamben writes, "We are accustomed to distinguishing between stateless persons and refugees, but this distinction, now as then, is not as simple as it might at first glance appear. From the beginning, many refugees who technically were not stateless preferred to become so rather than to return to their homeland. This is the case of Polish and Romanian Jews who were in France or Germany at the end of the war, or today of victims of political persecution, as well as those for whom returning to their homeland would mean the impossibility of survival." So the reference to Nuremberg in the essay situates the discussion regarding refugees and the relationship between rights as opposed to, the relationship between the rights of the citizen as opposed to inalienable human rights for all persons in the context of the history of Nazi Germany. So the Nuremberg race laws were instituted by the Nazi regime in 1935, and they were announced, and there were two laws announced in relation to race: the Reich Citizenship Law and the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor. These laws informally became known as the Nuremberg Laws or Nuremberg race laws. The Nazis enacted the Nuremberg Laws because they wanted to put their ideas about race into law. They believed in the false theory that the world is divided into distinct races that are not equally strong and valuable. Nazis considered Germans to be members of the supposed superior Aryan race. They saw the so-called Aryan German race as the strongest and the most valuable race of all. According to the Nazis, Jews were not Aryans. They thought Jews belonged to a separate race that was inferior to all other races. The Nazis believed that the presence of Jews in Germany threatened the German people. They believed they had to separate Jews from other Germans to protect and strengthen Germany. The Nuremberg laws were an important step towards achieving this goal. The Nazi Party had always promised that if they came to power, only racially pure Germans would be allowed to hold German citizenship. The Reich citizenship law made this a reality. Reich citizenship law made this a reality. This law defined a citizen as a person who is, quote, of German or related blood. This meant that Jews, defined as a separate race, could not be full citizens of Germany. They had no political rights. The law for the protection of German blood and German honor was a law against what the Nazis viewed as race mixing or race defilement. It banned future intermarriage and sexual relations between Jews and people, quote, of German or related blood. The Nazis believed that such relationships were dangerous because they led to mixed-race children. According to the Nazis, these children and their descendants undermine the purity of the German race. According to the Nuremberg laws, a person with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents was a Jew. A grandparent was considered Jewish if they belonged to the Jewish religious community. Thus, the Nazis defined Jews by their religion, Judaism, and not by the supposed racial traits that Nazism attributed to Jews. The laws also categorized some people in Germany as mixed-race persons, Mischling. According to law, Mischling were neither German nor Jewish. These were people who had 1 or 2 Jewish grandparents. The Nazi regime required individuals to prove their grandparents' racial identities. To do so, people used religious records. These included baptism records, Jewish community records, and gravestones. While initially focused on Jewish people, the Nazi government clarified that the Nuremberg laws also applied to Roma, also called Gypsies, Black people, and their descendants. They could not be full citizens of Germany, nor could they marry or have sexual relations with, quote, people of German or related blood. The Nuremberg laws changed the everyday lives of Jewish people in Germany by making Jews legally different from their non-Jewish neighbors. And I'm citing here from research that was compiled for the Holocaust Encyclopedia. So after the passage of laws, the Nazi regime enacted more and more anti-Jewish laws and decrees. These laws relied on the definition of, quote, Jew as defined in the Nuremberg laws. Examples of these other laws or decrees include the law on the alteration of family and personal names, the decree on passports of Jews, the police regulation on the making of Jews. The Nuremberg laws were an important step in the Nazi regime's process of isolating and excluding Jews from the rest of German society. So in the essay, We Refugees, then, Giorgio Agamben cites these historical documents about the Holocaust to consider the ways in which stateless persons can often not be considered to be persons because of the way that the law counts bodies as citizens who are deserving of rights, including access to health care, including access to bank accounts, including access to money, as opposed to persons. And so this kind of countenance of people as needing to be of pure blood, of historical descent in order to claim citizenship, essentially means that the inalienable rights of persons are often under threat. So that if one lives in a country but was not born in a country, or immigrates to a country, or flees to a country, then it can take years to become a citizen. And so the argument is that irrespective of the ways that modern democratic laws against anti-Semitism and against the waging of war or the theft of property have changed capital and have created a whole lexicon of human rights, the construction of the citizen as the only person who can access state resources is still obviously problematic, because a person cannot simply access these amenities without being a citizen or without having some claim to citizenship or claim to refugee status. I would argue that in some instances, people who are the most persecuted do not know that they are persecuted, and do not have a language in which to articulate their persecution, which is intelligible. The real materiality of war and exile and statelessness often means that those who are left without a home, without a state, without citizenship, might only be left with the material consequences of being ethnically cleansed, and might not understand what has happened. And this is particularly true of child refugees, and of people who are often so persecuted that they were stripped of access to education or literacy. The use of sexual violence in war also means that stateless persons, refugees, there are several names used, but it means that people who are persecuted and left without a home because of war might be so traumatized that they do not really know what has happened, or they cannot access language in the same way that someone could who has not been persecuted or ethnically cleansed. The actual use of language is, as we've discussed in previous lectures, what Pierre Bourdieu would term a form of cultural capital. So having the English language, having the terms in which to call oneself a refugee, a persecuted minority, someone who has been ethnically cleansed, a stateless person, an exile, is obviously a privilege that not all persons have. And I would argue that the most persecuted often lack the capacity to claim rights. So this is a clip of Giorgio Agamben.
Hey everyone, back again. Today I'm going to talk about Giorgio Agamben's idea or notion of homo sacer. Now, before jumping into that, if you want to follow me anywhere other than here, you can find me on Instagram at theory_and_philosophy, or on Twitter at David Guigno. If you're new here, welcome. I'm David. I try to explain philosophical texts and ideas in a way that makes them accessible to help you along your philosophical journey. So if you're new, make sure to subscribe. I'd love to see you back. If you want to help me out, you can do that by simply subscribing, liking, sharing, telling your friends, commenting, all that stuff. We gotta pump that algorithm a little bit. If you're listening to this in podcast form, you'll be able to find the video on YouTube. If you found this on YouTube, you'll be able to find this in podcast form anywhere where you get podcasts where there shouldn't be any ads. at least for now. If you are listening to this in podcast form, perhaps on Apple Podcasts, leave a review. 5 stars would help me out a lot. And yeah, you can help me out via Patreon or PayPal if you want to, but obviously no pressure. And I don't want to waste any more of your time with that stuff. Let's talk about Homo sacer, which is a complicated term, and I want to be quite upfront. I'm not going to be able to discuss every single part of this, especially the history of the term that Agamben is drawing from. You really have to read the entire book, Homo sacer, or sacer, whatever, for that. I'm just going to give you kind of a bare bones understanding of it to get your feet off the ground, essentially, and open up some possible criticisms I have of it and some of the ways that it informs perhaps Foucauldian notions of biopolitics or works against them to some extent as well. So let's jump into it. Now, at the core of the term Homo sacer is a kind of ambivalence. And the reason that there's an ambivalence is because sacer quite literally can refer to sacred. And when we think of sacred, we probably think someone who's exalted, maybe they're held in high esteem. But the tradition and the language, etymologically, that Agamben is drawing from actually paints the notion of sacredness or sacer in this way in a kind of negative light as well, where someone who was considered to be sacred or sacer was someone that could also be seen as being like dirty, like someone you weren't supposed to come in contact with, someone that could actually be like ostracized from the political order. Now, the reason he's digging into this question of sacredness is because, and he's really speaking to Walter Benjamin here, and the kind of question that Walter Benjamin opens about the sacredness of life in relation to divine law and what divine law might mean. And I've done an episode on Benjamin's text, The Critique of Violence, which you can find and check out on here if you want. But Agamben is really curious about this because there's been a kind of naive assumption that sacredness, is referring to something that is held in high esteem, something that is seen as being something to protect. Now, Agamben shows, because it is also associated with this kind of notion of being dirty, this image of dirtiness, that they are someone who has to be excluded. Now, that serves a very instrumental function for Agamben in constituting a political order, but we're gonna get there in a minute. We're gonna build here and arrive to that point. But that is essentially the end goal that Agamben wants to arrive at. So Homo sacer is a person, is a human, who is both beneath the law and outside of the law. That is, they are someone whose life can't be used to propitiate, which is a fancy word for saying that cannot feed or cannot be sacrificed, is someone whose life can't mean anything really for those people in authority, for the dominant social order. So, for example, they are so beneath life, they're so beneath citizenship, let's say, especially as we're referring to this in relation to the Roman tradition that he's really picking up on here, and the Greeks as well. Homo sacer is someone who is beneath citizenship, and so their life means nothing in terms of a sacrificial order. So you cannot sacrifice a Homo sacer with the hope of getting something from the gods, like have your crops grow or something like that. They are seen as being less than that. At the same time, they are also someone whose life means nothing, even if they're killed. So if you were to kill one of these people, or if they were to be killed, what that would mean was that nothing would befall you because it.
Women's backs are lagging a decade behind. We asked 1,000 of you what you considered essential, and then
because it was like you weren't even killing a human. So their lives couldn't be sacrificed to the gods, and their lives meant like nothing within the political order, which is very strange considering our perhaps immediate understanding of what a sacred person is. But historically, as Agamben shows, they are someone whose life could neither be used to propitiate the gods, nor could be seen as being something worth defending or punishing if they were to be killed by someone else. So the person who killed them couldn't be punished. Now, the emergence of this kind of figure, this person that can be killed with impunity, essentially, where nothing bad will happen, can only come about in a certain phase certain stage, a certain kind of mode of social organization, one that Agamben attributes specifically to the emergence of sovereign power, because it is the sovereign who has the capacity to kill without that killing being in the service of anything so-called meaningful in terms of a sacrificial order, or the killing being something that could then be retribution can be paid for it in the form of disciplinary measures or whatever. So the sovereign is the person who is given the potential, given the, I guess, authority to kill without committing homicide, and to, in that same act of killing, do it without it meaning anything in a sacrificial way. Because in the case of like a sacrifice, that person would hardly, the executioner, would hardly be someone considered to have committed a homicide, because it is part of that social order as being something that is approved, allowed for. Now, in this phase, because, or this kind of mode of social organization, in this social sphere, people are viewed as being less than, these specific people are viewed as being less than worthy to sacrifice, and so they can be killed with impunity. Now, at this point, they are reduced to what Agamben calls, and what he draws from etymologically, they are reduced to a kind of bare life, where all they are is a living being. And because they are only a living being, they're just flesh, essentially, they don't actually have any real meaning. And so they can be killed with absolutely no consequence. And so even though a person is held as being sacred, and we know now that that sacredness is not something to really be excited about, it serves a pretty instrumental function in that it is a necessary part of the establishment of sovereign power. So in that sense, it is kind of sacred. It's a necessary component and something we must strive for if we want to establish this kind of social organization, which is obviously not a great one. But these people are held in a kind of strange inverse exaltation where they are seen as being a necessary component of this system, precisely because they can be taken out of that system via killing without any kind of repercussion. Now, this is how Agamben establishes his own form of biopolitics, where people are reduced to kind of life only. And it is in that moment that they can then be killed without any kind of repercussions occurring. Now, this is both similar and different from the kind of biopolitics we get in Foucault, because Foucault doesn't pay quite as much attention to this possibility of death coming from this focus on life. In fact, he considers more about what the proliferation of life means in terms of power. Whereas Agamben is saying this proliferation of life, this acknowledgement of things as life, has pretty negative consequences, because then it strips people of anything beyond their flesh, because it strips them of anything beyond their zoe, being the term he draws upon here, anything other than just their lifeness. They don't have any kind of meaning beyond that. And that's a very scary moment, because it reduces people to that, just their biology, which houses no meaning in itself. Now, he uses the example of the Holocaust to also illustrate this, where the Jewish people, among other people at the time, were reduced to this kind of bare life. They had their rights taken, citizenship taken, everything like that, and reduced to only life. And he calls this a form of biopolitics in that way. And he says that obviously opened the door for this thing called the Holocaust, for that event that is still very much unimaginable that still occurred. Now, there's an issue that I have with this, just to give my own input, in that he reduces the Holocaust to like a kind of teleological inevitability to this thing called sovereign power and bare life. And while that may be true, in that we have certainly set the conditions for these types of events to occur, and they have occurred all across the world in terms of, as a result of this kind of sovereign power that he sketches, I think that he is too quick not to see the specificity of an event like the Holocaust as representing something more than just a kind of teleological consequence of this form of sovereign power, in that there were so many other historical situations that played a part, like the historical treatment of Jewish people certainly contributed to this. It wasn't just any people, and we can't lose sight of that fact. Like, the treatment of the Jewish people all throughout the world for thousands of years contributed to this as well. This is not just a demonstration of a kind of sovereign power that did this because it could. It was a sovereign power that also had these other baked in prejudices. And I think that Agamben downplays that to some extent. And that is really it. There's, to give you kind of basic introduction, there's not really much more to add than that. But of course, you get a lot more if you actually read the text. But yeah, if anyone, you listen this far, I'd love to hear what anyone else had to say, what you think might be worth adding. If anyone puts a comment in, that's really good. I love pinning them, so that everyone can see anything that should be added. Or if I mischaracterized anything, I'd love to hear about it. But yeah, if you like what I did here, leave 5 stars, like, share, review, and catch you next time. Take care.
So Giorgio Agamben is well known for the idea of bare life, which I'll also discuss in this lecture. And Agamben is interested in the ways that the state can kill groups of people with impunity. And the declaration of someone as being a person who does not have the rights to stay in a country and could be deported to a place where they could face persecution or death is a modern example, I think, of this use of state power to create conditions under which someone could die. And so the idea of the Homo sacer then calls into question the workings of the modern state as being different from a time of aristocracy. So in a different time, there would have been a king who could have beheaded somebody at their will. Now we have modern democracy and the rule of law and voters. However, a refugee or a stateless person can still be told that they do not have the right to stay in a place that could keep them alive. And so this use of state power to make people so precarious that they could die is still with us. And it is something that Agamben discusses in this essay from a symposium about Hannah Arendt's We Refugees. The basic point, writes Agamben, is that every time refugees no longer represent individual cases, but rather a mass phenomenon, as happened between the 2 wars and has happened again now. Both these organizations and the single states have been proven, despite the solemn evocations of the inalienable rights of man, to be absolutely incapable not only of resolving the problem, but also simply of dealing with it adequately. In this way, the entire question was transferred into the hands of the police and of humanitarian organizations. The reasons, writes Agamben, for this impetus lie not only in the selfishness and blindness of bureaucratic machines, but in the basic notions themselves that regulate the inscription of the native, that is, of life, in the legal order of the nation state. Hannah Arendt titled Chapter 5 of her book Imperialism, dedicated to the problem of refugees, the decline of the nation state, and the end of the rights of man. This formulation, which inextricably links the fates of the rights of man and the modern national state, such that the end of the latter necessarily implies the obsolescence of the former, should be taken seriously. The paradox here is that precisely the figure that should have incarnated the rights of man par excellence the refugee, constitutes instead the radical crisis of this concept. So the fact that the refugee does not cause nation states or the world to uphold the inalienable rights of people as people is a crisis in this concept, and a crisis after the Holocaust, and a crisis that happens again and again when people are denied the right to seek asylum or the right to flee persecution and are not believed to be worthy of these inalienable rights as people who can stay in a place and stay alive in a place. The concept of the rights of man and rights, based on the supposed existence of a human being as such, collapsed in ruins as soon as those who professed it found themselves for the first time before men who had truly lost every other specific quality and connection except for the mere fact of being humans. So the problem from a philosophical perspective, an ethical perspective, and a political perspective is the relationship between this individual case of the refugee and a mass phenomenon. And this idea of the mass and the individual takes us back to the subject matter of the course, race and racism. So if there was a case of one person fleeing persecution, this would be different than a mass of people who are then often described in anti-immigration rhetoric and anti-refugee rhetoric as being a group of people who could threaten the purity of the imagined local population. So I would argue that racism and the relationship between race, ethnicity, religion, and nation state and nation building remains central to the persecution of immigrants and refugees, and the justification for the killing of those who cannot flee persecution because in many instances their nationality, but also race and religion and ethnicity does not correspond to the fantasies of white nation building. The concept of the rights of man around rights, based on the supposed existence of a human being as such, collapsed in ruins as soon as those who professed it found themselves for the first time before men who had truly lost every other specific quality and connection except for the mere fact of being humans. So when one who has lost every other quality and connection except for this fact of being human tries to seek refuge, they can come upon a situation in which people are not just human. They're white and middle class, and they're citizens. And all of this idea of superiority beyond the human, beyond a kind of universal humanity, is what makes white supremacy and systemic racism terrifying to those who are the most persecuted and in need of some basic care and concern. In the nation-state system, the so-called sacred and inalienable rights of man proved to be completely unprotected at the very moment it is no longer possible to characterize them as rights of the citizen of a state. And this is an interesting point that Agamben makes in this essay about these two terms that are used in these laws that were passed. So this is implicit if one thinks about it in the ambiguity of the very title of the Declaration of 1789, Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen, Declaration of the Rights of Man and of Citizen. And so what Agamben states is that it is unclear whether the two terms name two realities or whether instead they form a hendidatus, in which the second term is in reality already contained in the first. So the second term, the rights of the citizen, what Agamben asks is the second term about the rights of the citizen contained in the first? And if one is not a citizen, can they be a person? And can they access things that another person can? And while one would want to say yes, in order to say yes, there have to be a whole series of processes of recognition of someone as a stateless person or a refugee. In order to even access things like a bank account, the right to work, food security, and healthcare, one has to be recognized as someone who has a claim to make in a certain place. It is possible for people to be people without the state, and this is where grassroots activism, vigilantism, and a kind of avant-garde political community emerge. Nation state means a state that makes nativity or birth, that is, of the bare human life, the foundation of its own sovereignty. So this foundation of sovereignty as being connected to nativity is important, I think, and interesting to consider in relation to the contemporary banning of abortion in many states throughout the United States of America. The banning of abortion in America happens at the same time that many people are fleeing persecution and trying to claim, often unsuccessfully, the right to stay in a country like the United States of America. So the fiction that Agamben discusses between native and nativity here is that birth immediately becomes nation, such that there can be no distinction between the two moments. Rights, that is, are attributable to man only in the degree to which he is the immediately vanishing presupposition. Indeed, he must never appear simply as man of the citizen. So this is an interesting concept to think about in relation to Saidiya Hartman's work regarding slavery and birth. So the fiction implicit here is that birth immediately becomes nation. However, that fiction has always been a racialized fiction. Birth of Black children, African American children, has never been equated with nation. And Saidiya Hartman makes the point that there has always been this inherent anxiety about the birth of free Black persons. And there was also a great deal of Nazi style eugenics in trying to control the fertility and reproduction of Black people during slavery. So I would argue that this conflation between birth and nation has always been highly suspicious if one thinks about the ways that contemporary racism still equates skin color and ethnicity and religion with certain nations, irrespective of where one is born. So even if you are born in a country, if you are not part of the majority, throughout the whole course of one's life, they will be asked to claim another country as their own. So Agamben further writes, if in the system of the nation state, the refugee represents such a disquieting element, it is above all because by breaking up the identity between man and citizen, between nativity and nationality, the refugee throws into crisis the original fiction of sovereignty. Single exceptions to this principle have always existed, of course. The novelty of our era, which threatens the very foundations of the nation state, is that growing proportions of humanity can no longer be represented within it. It would be well not to forget that the first camps in Europe were built as places to control refugees, and that the progression internment camps, concentration camps, extermination camps represents a perfectly real affiliation. One of the few rules the Nazis faithfully observed in the course of the final solution was that only after the Jews and Gypsies were completely denationalized, even of that second-class citizenship that belonged to them after the Nuremberg laws, could they be sent to the extermination camps. When the rights of man are no longer the rights of the citizen, then he is truly sacred, in the sense that this term had in archaic Roman law, destined to die. What the industrialized states are faced with today is a permanently resident mass of non-citizens who neither can be nor want to be naturalized or repatriated. Often these non-citizens have a nationality of origin, but inasmuch as they prefer not to make use of their state's protection, they are, like refugees, stateless de facto. So the number of people who are trying to claim refugee status in this time period is really noteworthy, and it's interesting to consider the numbers and also the geographies. So at the end of 2022, the United Nations reported that 108.4 million people worldwide forcibly displaced as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, human rights violations, and events seriously disturbing public order. This represents an increase of 19 million people in the world who were forcibly displaced at the end of 2021. Over 1 in 70 people on Earth has been forced to flee in their lifetime. Ongoing and new conflicts have driven forced displacement across the globe. The Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 created the fastest displacement crisis and one of the largest since the Second World War. At the end of 2022, a total of 11.6 million Ukrainians remained displaced, including 5.9 million within their country and 5.7 million who fled to neighboring countries and beyond. Conflict and insecurity in other parts of the world either continued or was reignited, such as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ethiopia, and Myanmar, where more than 1 million people were displaced within each country. So between 2021 and 2022, the United Nations recorded the largest yearly increase ever recorded in history of refugees. The numbers went up from 27.1 million to 35.3 million. Most people who are forced to flee have never crossed an international border. They remain displaced within their own countries, and they are known as internally displaced people. And they account for 58% of all forcibly displaced people. The largest number of people displaced within their own country was 6.8 million in Syria, consistent with the end of the previous year. This means that 1 in 3 of all Syrians remaining within their country were still internally displaced at the end of 2020 after more than a decade of conflict. Agamben discusses Palestinian refugees specifically in this essay. There are 425 Palestinians who were expelled by the state of Israel. According to Hannah Arendt's suggestion, these men constitute, quote, the avant-garde of their people. And we can again come back to the real difficulty of this position of being expelled and yes, also constituting the avant-garde. And one of the problems with thinking in positive terms about political activism or creative production is that we forget that it is often the most alienated and persecuted who often create new language and new politics from a place of real despair. So this is a clip about Palestinian refugees trying to claim asylum in the United States of America.
As the administration considers bringing Palestinians here to the U.S. as refugees, do you know how many people that the U.S. hopes to relocate? And secondly, given the challenges getting in and out of Gaza, will the U.S. assist in physically bringing Palestinians here?
So let me just first start saying that we just don't have anything to announce at this time. But I do want to lay out a little bit and take a step back of what we've been able to do since the beginning of the conflict, right? We have helped more than 1,800 American citizens and their families leave Gaza, many of whom have come to the United States. So many of that 18,000 is here. And the president has said, and with his direction, we have also helped and will continue to help some particularly vulnerable individuals, such as children with serious health problems and children who were receiving treatment for cancer, get out of harm's way and receive care at nearby hospitals in the region. And let's not forget the president, this administration continues to be the largest contributor of humanitarian assistance. This is something that the secretary is going to be talking about in this hour. The humanitarian assistance going into Gaza to address the conditions, the humanitarian conditions in Gaza. Obviously, as we know, they are very dire, and we are pressing hard to get more urgently needed aid into more people as soon as possible. That's why this hostage deal is so critical, besides, of course, getting the hostages home, but also creating an opportunity to get that more additional humanitarian aid in and would lead to a ceasefire. Now, in terms of the refugee admissions program, which is what I believe you're asking me about, We are constantly evaluating policy proposals to further support Palestinians who are family members of American citizens and may want to come to the United States. So we're evaluating it. I don't have anything to announce at this time.
And then a quick one on the communications with protests and people related to protests. Has the president spoken to Mayor Adams since the NYPD became involved in dealing with them?
Understand the question, don't have anything to read out as far as a conversation with the mayor from the president, but I think we've been very, very clear about what we're seeing on the ground. I've been answering these questions for the past couple of days.
Thank you.
You said the president is monitoring the situation. Is he aware of the reports that a fair number of the people arrested on several campuses are not students?
That is something for obviously local government to speak to, local government, local police and law enforcement to speak to, and what they're seeing and what they're reporting. That is something that I can't speak to at this time. I've heard that reporting, but that is something for them to speak to at this time.
But he's not aware of that.
Well, he's getting regularly updated on the situation and monitoring. So I assume that that's part of his update, but he is getting regularly updated on what's happening across the country and campuses.
Picture a childhood where every doorway
So these questions about state sovereignty and the power to declare this distinction between inalienable rights and citizenship are obviously still with us and at the heart of some of our most active social movements and protest movements. So I will finish then with this idea of bare life, that these questions of who can and cannot stay in a place and stay alive in a place are really ones about violence and the capacity to commit acts of violence with impunity, specifically against minorities, against those whose bodies do not have a role to play in fantasies of racial and religious nation building that imply a superiority of the most affluent people in a country or place. So this idea of purity of the body and the nation is central to how people become stateless to the point of death. Bare life derives from Giorgio Agamben's concept of homo sacra, a permanent yet invisible space of maximal political power. Here, persons legally reduced to the status of mere life can be subjected to any manner of violence with impunity. Agamben suggests that we have all become bare life because state powers sublimate conceptions of the natural life within the human body politic bios. Agamben's critique can be applied to conditions of life such as those suffered by the First Nations in Canada, political prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, and the current refugee crisis. Shili Memembe, expanding Agamben's line of thought, argues in Necropolitics that we now face, quote, the interest of maximum destruction of persons and the creation of death worlds, new and unique forms of social existence in which vast populations are subjected to conditions of life, conferring upon them the status of living dead. So Agamben is interested in the idea of the coming community in this really well-cited essay about homo sacra. And Agamben is well known for these ideas of homo sacra, bare life, and the coming community. The community translation of this term as whatever, in the sense of it does not matter which indifferently, is certainly correct. But in its form from the Latin says exactly the opposite. Quodlibet ens is not being. It does not matter which, but rather being such that it always matters. The Latin always already contains that as a reference to the will. Whatever being has an original relation to desire. The whatever in question here relates to singularity, not in its indifference with respect to a common property, to a concept, for example, being red, being French, being Muslim, but not only in its being such as it is. Singularity is thus freed from the false dilemma that obliges knowledge to choose between the ineffability of the individual and the intelligibility of the universal. So it's interesting to do a close reading, and I think it's useful to do a close reading of some of Agamben's work. The whatever in question here, writes Agamben, relates to singularity, not in its indifference with respect to a common property, to a concept, for example, being red, being French, being Muslim. So this idea of whatever is not indifferent to this concept of a common identity, but only in its being such as it is. Singularity is thus freed from the false dilemma that obliges knowledge to choose between the ineffability of the individual and the intelligibility of the universal. So this idea of abstracting the individual from the common identity, being red, being French, being Muslim, is really at the heart of this question of citizenship and personhood. So when we try to abstract the concept of identity as a communal identity from these individual rights, we mask the way that this kind of refusal to acknowledge the plurality that exists in singularity masks power. So singularity does not exist in this false dilemma that obliges knowledge to choose between the ineffability of the individual and the intelligibility of the universal. So ineffability is the quality of something that surpasses the capacity of language to express it, often being in the form of a taboo or incomprehensibility. So if singularity is thus freed from the false dilemma that obliges knowledge to choose between the ineffability of the individual, that which can never be captured about any of our individual personhood, and the intelligibility of the universal, that we are an identity. So what Agamben, I think, is then discussing is this term, whatever. It does not matter which, indifferently, but rather being such that it always matters. And so this kind of collapsing between the individual as a person who has a set of expressions or ideas or a self that is their own, and this intelligibility that we are people who belong to certain categories is, I think, an interesting idea if we consider the problem that Agamben poses in the essay between this collapsing or this between this relationship between the term citizen and person. So that a person obviously is someone who could be anyone. What I desire as a person could be completely unknown to the world, or it could be something I cannot express in language, or that people might not understand. But the reason that the category of persons must exist in law is that there are a whole set of inalienable rights that we have as persons. And as persons who are also counted as being red or being French or being Muslim. So this whatever then is this coming community that would not see a false dilemma between this ineffability of the individual and the intelligibility of the universal. The problem with racial superiority or white supremacy or casteism or any kind of ethnic nation building is that there's always this dichotomy between one's capacity for full expression as an individual and one's belonging to this imagined group or community. That this kind of or this desire to build, say, a pure ethnic and religious nation state can count count bodies in relation to categories and not categories of persons who have human emotions or human desire, like the desire to love or for romantic partnership or have children, will always be counted as members of communities who can or cannot have children with each other, who can or cannot express their desire. So the coming community is part of Giorgio Agamben's kind of wider, or it's one of many texts that really exemplifies Giorgio Agamben's ethos as a philosopher. Um, and Agamben responds to many philosophers in this text. It is a kind of writing about community as a linguistic belonging that moves beyond identity and universality. So Agamben's efforts often involve trying to think outside of these very static ideas of, say, the rights of man and also the rights of citizen, to think of something else that lies beyond these constructions of both persons as persons who are individuals and individuals, say, in capitalism, or as people who are members of community. And this is one of the things I think that Agamben alludes to in this text. And the relationship between language and community is central to Agamben's work. And in this essay from the syllabus, We Refugees, language is central to the ways that people cannot be assimilated and can be made so precarious that they could die and die as stateless people. So the common community then is this idea of trying to create a community beyond any conception available under a name. Not a community of essences or essentialist communities, but a community that is beyond our grasp as people who think in these ways that are often so exclusive that our exclusivity lends itself to genocide when taken to extremes. So in the interest of time, I will finish there. I'll record another lecture about Agamben and migration and refugee studies, and about the relationship between citizenship, refugees, stateless persons, and race. And I'll post a second lecture, but for this class, I'll finish here. Giorgio Agamben writes in State of Exception, one day humanity will play with law just as children play with disused objects, not in order to restore them to their canonical use, but to free them from it for good. So that is all. As I said, I hope you're enjoying the class thus far. I hope you are finding the lectures and the course content interesting and useful for your future graduate school purposes and your future law school purposes, and just your own interest in the subject matter. The presentation is due on Thursday, and some of you have emailed me because you are unclear of the requirements, or sorry, the requirements that I have given you in writing are not clear. So I'll try to explain it in words. All you have to do is to choose one of the week's readings from the syllabus and create an original presentation that is a minimum of 10 minutes. It could be even almost 10 minutes in that range. And the presentation should include an original thesis where you discuss some aspect of the reading. So if you were to, for example, if you were to select this week and this reading, We Refugees, you could give a presentation about a contemporary crisis in the media regarding refugees, and then you could draw on Agamben and Hannah Arendt as your citations. So when you're given marks for research, all this means is that instead of just sharing our own ideas, we're asked in the academic world to use citations. And so the citations can come from one of the week's readings. You can also use sources outside of the course if you choose to. I hope that's clear. The assignment is just meant to ask you to reflect in a presentation format on some of the course content and some of the ideas from the class. So you also don't have to appear on screen. Some of us don't enjoy appearing on screen for many reasons, or don't want to, so it can be audio. And finally, you really don't want to do a presentation, you can do an alternative writing assignment. And please contact me if this is the case and we can discuss it. So it's due on the 30th, which is 2 days from now. So I hope that it's on Thursday. So I hope that you are doing well, and please contact me if you have any questions. After the presentation assignment, the final assignment is due in June at the end of the class. And that's it. I hope you're doing well, and thank you for your attendance in the class and your participation. And I hope that you are enjoying yourself wherever you may be, as this is an online class. Okay, au revoir. Bonne soirée.